My name is Morris Williams, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to another fabulous discussion in what I call the intellectual treasure chest of Philadelphia, namely the Free Library Lecture events. So let me also tell you a couple of things about Dan Rather that's not in your program. You all know he's from Texas. I'm not sure all of you know that he went to Sam Houston State University, a good American historical figure. You may also not know that having left CBS more recently, he hooked up with another famous Texan, Mark Cuban. And so you've heard Mr. Cuban's name being mentioned as a possible independent presidential candidate, self-financed, so perhaps you'll want to quiz Mr. Rather about that. You also may be interested to know that he now has an independent production company. And what a surprise. The name of the company, News and Guts. So I think that is a very apt description of Dan Rather. Mr. Rather tonight will be interviewed by Tracey Matisak. You've seen her on Fox TV, WHYY. You've seen her here interviewing various people. You know she's very talented with that regard. And so without further ado, let's give a wonderful Philadelphia welcome to Tracey Matisak and Dan Rather.
And what an honor it is to have Dan Rather with us tonight.
Thank you.
You know, Mr. Rather, before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge someone very important who's with us tonight. The book is What Unites Us, Reflections on Patriotism, but Mr. Rather's co-author is here tonight, Elliot Kirshner. Elliot, where are you? There he is. He's way in the back. They wrote the book together. So welcome to Philadelphia. Welcome back.
Thank you.
What prompted you and Elliot to write this book?
Well, partly our success, if you can call it that, on Facebook and social media. One of my surprises, one of the most pleasant things to happen to me in my 85th and 86 years was that I reluctantly came to social media and, we found an audience. And one of the things we tried to do on the Facebook page and on the News and Guts Facebook page was bring some context and perspective to current events and to try to be a steady and stable voice in the havoc of the headlines of the day. That was our goal on social media. So when we found an audience on social media and the last election was completed and we entered the, for better or for worse, the Trump era. I found many people in our social media community, in our Facebook community, who were really worried, quite fearful. I sometimes ask myself, well, were their fears justified, fully justified or not? But at any rate, in thinking about that, said to myself, well, you know, if we just think about being steady, just hold steady. It's one of the things that Americans have been good at. We're not good at everything, but history has shown that we're very good, particularly when the danger is greatest, when the pressure is the most. We're pretty steady. So that kind of thinking led to doing the essays that are in the book on the values that I think we sometimes forget in the frustration of the moment or in the outrage of the moment. It's too easy to forget those values that are overwhelmingly shared by most Americans, whatever their partisan political leanings or ideological beliefs. And they are the values that have carried us this far with the historical experiment that is our beloved United States.
The subtitle is Reflections on Patriotism. How do you define patriotism?
Well, I have actually gone to the dictionary, and one of the things I recommend is people go to the dictionary and look up the word patriotism, because particularly in the present environment, there's a lot of confusion about what patriotism is by dictionary definition. And there's a real effort by some in the national leadership to confuse patriotism with nationalism. They are two different words with two different meanings. They do overlap in some cases. But in answer to your question, to me, patriotism is a deep love of the country with humility, the kind of humility that leads one to say, I love the country deeply. I would die for the country in a moment if asked or necessary to do so. But I recognize that we've made our mistakes, we're imperfect, and to have a conversation not with just our fellow Americans, but with the world about how we can improve, how we can forever be reaching for that goal laid out in our Constitution. You know, the Constitution said we seek to make a more perfect union, recognizing it wasn't perfect, it couldn't be perfect, but striving, ever striving to be a more perfect union. So to me, that's patriotism. There's no arrogance in patriotism. There's no conceit in patriotism. Nationalism, which is not a bad trait in and of itself, but taken to extremes, nationalism can lead to conceit and arrogance, an attitude of, listen, we're the greatest in the world. We have been, we are, we will be, and there's nobody our equal anywhere. And while we may have some, I'm paraphrasing here, we may have some slight imperfections, you know, we are terrific. Nationalism connotates those things. I do want to emphasize that there is a place for nationalism, a considered nationalism can be an important part of patriotism. I don't want to overcomplicate the answer, but the danger with nationalism, and we know from history that extreme economic nationalism led to the Great Depression. We had extreme economic nationalism in the 1920s, and that's what led to the Depression. And extreme racial nationalism, as in Aryan nationalism, which is white nationalism, can very quickly lead to nativism and then lead to tribalism. And in a country such as ours, we're not at this point. But if we ever reach the point where we go from authoritarianism to extreme nationalism, then slide into nativism, tribalism, then we will not have the system of government we have today. So when I say this is a perilous time, it is a perilous time in our country. As I try to reflect in what unites us, I'm an optimist by experience and by nature. And I think we'll get through this. But we won't get through this just by just saying to ourselves, oh, well, it'll pass. That our system is built on every individual citizen taking responsibility at the time. So while I do think it's a perilous and dangerous time for the country, I think we have an opportunity, and if with what unites us, the book that I've contributed even in some microscopic way to some individuals and groups of individuals saying, let's pause, lower our voices, be civil to one another when we can without giving up our principles, and let's think about what are those values that have gotten the country this far and how we can concentrate on those values rather than allowing our leadership to shout a hymn of division.
You mentioned race a moment ago, and you devote a lot of ink in the book to the subject of race. And I wonder how you, as a young boy growing up in a segregated part of Texas, became aware of the reality of race in America.
Well, I do, this is detailed in what unites us. But I grew up in Texas. As I'm still fond of saying, I'm, Texas born, Texas raised, and when I did, I'll be Texas dead. I was born in a farming community of Horton, but grew up basically on the outskirts of Houston. Texas was a segregated society. There was institutional racism, which is to say the segregation was enforced by the law, at that time state law. I went to segregated public schools. I never went to anything other than a public school, including a small college, Sam Houston State Teachers College. All of them were segregated. The city itself was segregated. Now, it wasn't the deep kind of hatred didn't prevail as much as did, say, in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, but no getting around it. Strictly segregated society. And as I write in What Unites Us, I wish I could tell you that the Rathers around their dinner table were one of those families that talked about the perils of racism and the injustice of it, and that we were very progressive thinkers. That would not be true. It is not an excuse to say so, but the prevailing mood among whites, including myself and my own family, was this is just the way things are. That's the way things are. So in answer to your question, when did I become aware? It wasn't until I was in high school that I gave it any thought whatsoever. And again, I would like to tell you that I was struck by lightning, or I had a revelation and suddenly became very knowledgeable. Just 9th, 10th, or 11th grade is the first time I even became aware, well, there is another school, another set of schools for people. But it wasn't until I came to CBS News in 1962 and began covering the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King. That was my assignment on a day-by-day basis. That was, it's hard for me to describe it because it made such an impression on me and drove home to me how deep the injustice was and what effect it had on the country. And covering Dr. King changed me as a person and changed me as a professional. Now, while covering Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in 1962 and 63, I did flash back to one incident, which again is written in What Unites Us, that my father, who was not a flaming opponent of segregation at all, but at a civic club meeting, that is to say a precinct meeting just after World War II, he took me to the precinct meeting. And at that time, the Democratic Party in Texas, if you won the Democratic primary, it was tantamount to election. There were no Republicans, quite different from today. In fact, my father would joke that, and he meant it as a joke, when he said, you know, Republicans, he said, I can take you out to our Herman Park Museum, and they have one stuffed there. I will show it to you, and there's a rumor that great herds of them run up north. But at any rate, at that precinct meeting, which was designed to elect delegates to the county Democratic Convention and the state Democratic Convention, had been, since the Civil War, and even before, had been all white. There were 4 or 5 African Americans who had come back from the war in the service. At any rate, it was a very tense situation. I was frankly a little afraid at the time. But my father, again, he was not a big champion of civil rights or anything. He just said to me, when they stand, we stand. That is, I mean, they take a vote and a standing vote, and the whole idea with it, which we did, which created a lot of controversy inside. It was kind of a tough situation. But that, I'd love to say from that moment on, I was very aware of racial injustice, but it wouldn't be true. When I started covering Dr. King, I did have flashbacks at that and say, you know, that's where a lot of this started, a lot of this being the civil rights movement, that African Americans fought and fought valiantly in World War II. The Army was still segregated, and they were not allowed in some units, but nonetheless, when they came back from the war, I think it gave the civil rights movement, which had already had its stirrings well before then, gave it a better momentum going forward.
You write about a sort of a defining moment with Medgar Evers going to a voting place with him. Can you take us back to that day and tell us what happened?
Yes. Well, Medgar Evers was, he was the NAACP representative, either officially or unofficially, in Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi. And when I first began covering Dr. King and the movement in early 1962, he's one of the first people that I met. And for whatever reason, we just connected almost right away. First of all, he was a very intelligent, very sensitive, but tough man in the best sense of toughness. You know, we used to say in my old neighborhood in Houston that there's tough, there's street tough, and there's prison tough. Well, Medgar had never been to prison, but he was something beyond prison tough. But at any rate, I would go with him to various events and talk with him about what the situation was in Mississippi. And we once went to, it was a primary vote, and there were African Americans in Jackson who had never voted, but were qualified to vote. They had paid their poll tax, they had, but they were afraid to go to the polls. And Medgar said, I'll lead you to the polls. Not all of them would go. They said, look, it's too terrible. And we got there, and you know, there were the obligatory police or sheriff cars around. But at any rate, Medgar Evers, in his valor, walked up and, you know, I won't repeat what was said, but there were racial epithets said, like, you know, get out of here. And Medgar said, well, you know, these people are all qualified voters. I'm paraphrasing here. They're all qualified voters, and if you look on your list, they have the list. And the answer was, well, I don't give a damn who they are, they're not voting. And there was a tense moment or two, and they were not allowed to vote. Now, having told you that I grew up in the segregation of Houston, and there was institutional racism, I had never seen this, and frankly, I had not thought it possible in the America of 1962. But I witnessed it myself. Now, unfortunately, Medgar was assassinated not very long after that. He was shot to death in front of his wife and his children on his front porch by a coward who hid in the weeds across the street, in a story that to this day is seen one of the landmark stories of the civil rights movement. But that's the story of Medgar Evers. There's now a school named after him in New York City. So far as I know, there's no school named after him in Mississippi.
In addition to the civil rights movement, of course, you covered the Vietnam War. I was wondering, did you see the Ken Burns series recently on the Vietnam War? And if you did, what was it like to see it through his lens?
Well, I have not seen all of it. I think there are 2 remaining installments that I have not seen, but I've seen a great deal of it, and I admire it. I do want to say, to be perfectly open about it, that Ken Burns is a friend of mine, and I'm happy to say, and I always admire his work. But as objectively as I can, this is a masterpiece, which is not to say that I don't have my arguments with some parts of it, or some of it I question. But it took them 10 years to do it. It's a masterful piece of work. But I didn't want to, for a while I put off seeing it. And then even when I started seeing it, I thought, I better try this only in small doses, because I don't want to be overly dramatic about it. But I spent almost a year, covering the Vietnam War in 1965 and 66. I was back another 3 times, never for that long. But I do not have good memories of it, to say the least. Now again, put this in perspective, I was not a combatant. Those who fought the war are the ones who have the worst memories. But nonetheless, I bore witness to the war. So I was reluctant to get into the Burns documentary for that reason. I was a little uncomfortable when it first started, and to tell you the truth, I was still, I wouldn't say force myself to see it, but it wasn't a pleasant experience for me.
It's difficult.
But as I say, you know, I get paid as a professional to be as objective as I possibly can. And by any reasonable analysis, this is a masterwork and certainly delivers good value for time for anybody who takes the time to see it.
You write about dissent in our nation, and certainly there was plenty of that during the time of the Vietnam War. Why are those voices of dissent so important, and who would you say are those voices today?
Well, to deal with the general first about dissent, that it is one of the values that has made us. Some people, I know, raise their eyebrows at that, but by any, again, reasonable analysis of American history, a great deal of the progress that we've made as a people, as a society, has been dissent, began with dissent. Perhaps one example would be women's right to vote. When the early suffragettes, when the women of the 19th century were talking about allowing women to vote, they were considered radicals. This was dissent and called unpatriotic, and every other name you could think of. And it wasn't until roughly the World War I period that they finally got the vote. Still sticks in my craw that it took us almost into 1/5 of the 20th century before women got the vote. But my point here is, this is an example of what started as dissent, and very unpopular dissent, came to be seen as a need for justice, and we eventually delivered on it. This has been our whole history. You can say that our revolution, the American Revolution, began as dissent. We can argue whether it was dissent over taxes or just disliking King, but it was dissent. So I do think this has gotten clouded a little, and some of it has been purposely equating dissent with a lack of patriotism or a lack of caring about the country as much as some other people do. Now, and the whole business of rights for African Americans, which brought us to our most decisive period in history during the Civil War, began as dissent and very unpopular dissent, another example. Now, today, I want to make very clear, I'm going to give as an example, the dissent over what many people, and not only many African Americans, many people, not a majority, but many people perceive as an inequality of justice in the hands of some police. This has led to this not standing for the national anthem. It's a form of dissent. I want to make it explicitly clear, I stand for the national anthem. I stand without apology, with my hand over my heart, and I usually at least mouth the words to the national anthem. In fact, with my grandsons, I like to sing it aloud. That's what's within me. That's how I feel about the national anthem. However, for those who take a knee during the national anthem, they have a right to do that. They consider themselves conscious bound to do it, and I respect that. I respect their right to do it, and I want to listen carefully to their explanation of why they're doing it. There are partisan political forces and what I consider to be radical ideological forces who want to see immediately, oh, it's all about disrespect for the flag, disrespect for our military. Well, as I understand it, that's not what those who are kneeling say that it's about. So here's the case. It's dissent. It's unpopular dissent. But it's attempting to call attention to injustice. And here's a case where if we lower our voices and say, let's listen to one another, we may indeed learn something, and it may lead to the correction of some injustices. So that's how I feel about it.
What role does the media play in this day? You write about the importance, perhaps now more than ever, of a free and independent press. What should be the role of the media in the times in which we live?
Well, as we all learned, or should have learned, no later than 7th grade civics class, and I think it's a time to remind ourselves that a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely independent when necessary press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. And either we're going to have that kind of press, or we're not going to have the kind of government we have now. That's not just from Dan Rather. Thomas Jefferson cited Abraham Lincoln, cited practically every one of our esteemed to be great presidents. It's true, and I think most Americans down somewhere deep within themselves know it to be true. However, increasingly, and we've unfortunately seen more examples of it in the last roughly 1 year than I can remember seeing before, there's a conscious effort. There's a conscious effort to propagate the idea, to sell the idea that the problems of the country are not the problems, that the problems are the people who call attention to the problems. These, quote, damn press people who keep digging around. And that idea, which is not a new idea, it's just the major leaders, some of the major leaders of the country have just tried harder, like to get it. Now, it needs to be said that, those of us in the press, I always prefer the word press rather than media, but if you prefer media, we make our mistakes. We are not perfect. I certainly have not been. I've made my mistakes. I have wounds, some of them self-inflicted, some of them still open. But news is not a precise science. It is, on its best days, a kind of crude art. Nobody can do it perfectly. But what the press does, what it should do when it's serving the country best, is try to be, in no particular order, one, an honest broker of information. Its role is to seek facts. I recognize we're in a period where there's even an attempt to make an argument about what facts are. Perhaps we want to discuss that later. But nonetheless, the role of the press is to get facts and get as close to the truth as is humanly possible to get, and to make that available to citizens. That's the basic role of the press. Now, part of that is to be a part of the system of checks and balances, that our whole system of government is built on having checks on all positions of power. And the press is one of those. We have the courts, we have a constitution, and the press is part of the system of checks and balances. Those are the things we are supposed to do. Now, having said we can't do it perfectly, and we don't do it perfectly, the effort to demonize the press is one of the classic marks of authoritarianism. That this is the way it starts. We know from history this is the way it started in a number of places. You have a free elected government. People tend to forget that both Mussolini and Hitler in the very beginning were both elected in free elections. They take an authoritarian tone. Authoritarianism then can lead to extreme nationalism that we talked about before, where that slide starts. So while I'm not alarmed by what's happening now, I do feel an obligation, and I try to do so in what unites us, to get back to basics and to remind people, look, you can complain about the press, and particularly when the complaint is justified, make your voice heard. Those of us in the press can use a double dose of humility and modesty about what we do, to be very quick when we make mistakes, to acknowledge it, all of those things. But in the face of this unrelenting personal attack on the press and press institutions, which is unique in our history, when I say what we're going through now, not just the press, what the country's going through now, when I say it is not normal, there's an effort to make us, to convince us as a people, as a society, that, well, this is just normal. Most presidents act this way. No, this is not normal. This is a unique time. And when you talk about these unrelenting attacks on the press, I find people who say, well, Dan, you were around during the Richard Nixon time. Richard Nixon cared none about the press. True. But, and President Nixon did his best to intimidate the press. However, even President Nixon, he never personally delivered anything close to what's now being said by the President of the United States. And I want to make this very clear. I'm not here to have a screed against Donald Trump, and his name is not mentioned in What Unites Us. It's certainly not, the book is not a screed about him. But on the press business, what kind of people would we be? I started to say, what kind of men and women would we be if when the president personally attacks on a personal basis individual reporters? For example, that never to be forgotten scene in which a reporter with physical challenges was in front of the president, and the president mocked him. We've never had that before with any president. This is not normal. And I would say, this is not American. We want to talk about something that is not consistent with Americans' view of themselves. We don't make fun of people who have physical challenges. We give them empathy. My own favorite chapter in this book is empathy, but that's another subject. But back to the point with the president, and also that while President Nixon used surrogates to attack the press, he primarily used his vice president Spiro Agnew and other surrogates to attack the press and to threaten institutions of the press. You go back, and rarely did you hear anything out of President Nixon's own voice with him saying it. Whereas in the present circumstance, the president seems to take delight in doing it, and I think he does so because he believes he is making some headway in convincing people. He says things like, you know, the people in the press are among the worst people in the country, and says worse things about it. So personal, direct attacks with the full power and panoply of the president behind them on individual journalists and on institutions of journalism who are doing reporting which is not to his favor. Now again, we have to pull back here for what we call in television the wide shot. What's going on here? What's going on here is an authoritarian impulse in the most powerful position in the world, who has convinced himself that by constantly attacking the press, he can undermine the credibility of the press and intimidate the press, particularly when he talks about, and this is a paraphrase, but you could go back and check the direct quote, and he said on several occasions, in effect, to an institution such as Washington Post, a threat. It might be a veiled threat, but it's basically, if you keep reporting the kind of investigative expose stuff on me you've been doing, you know, I'm the president, and the executive branch has power that can hurt you. Now, President Nixon did some of that, but not in his own words, and he didn't say it, and not to the extent of this president. Now, we have a lot of greater problems than the problems of attempts to intimidate the press. Because, you know, those of us in the press, we're kind of ornery about things, you know. And we have a lot of faults, but we don't cower very easily. We're hard to herd and almost impossible to stampede. And you're seeing some manifestations of that now. Despite the president's attacks on the press, some of the best investigative reporting in the last 5 or 10 years is being done now. So there we are with that, but it isn't that, it's very important to understand, I find increasingly people do understand that President Trump's strategy, if you want to call it that, is never to apologize, never say you're sorry, and to anybody and everybody who raises any questions whatsoever about your policies or about your personality, to attack, attack, attack. Roger Stone, who was helpful in the Nixon years, been a Republican operative for some time, helped to teach him that. But I think if you understand that that's his mindset with President Trump, that it's always attack, never apologize, then you have what he's doing in somewhat better context. Now the question is, how successful is he going to be? He continues to do it because to himself, I'm certainly not a psychologist. Psychologists are very plain. He won the election. He believes that he won the election because he did just that. Never made any excuse, never apologized, attacked everything. Right? So any hope that he would change during his presidency turns out to be a one hope because he sees that it led to his success.
Well, that brings me to yesterday's elections, and I'm wondering what you make of the results that we saw. We saw Democrats make some big gains, an off-year election, but as you watched all that unfold, I wondered what you made of all that.
Well, for one, I was relieved. I can't say I was surprised. I was somewhat relieved, but not for the reason you may think. That I have such confidence in the country. One of the reasons I wanted to write a book that had running through it strong strains of hope is because I am optimistic about things. And there's an ebb and flow to American politics. It has, in the end, been one of our strengths. We can begin drifting in one direction or another, if you want to make it left, right, liberal, conservative, reaction, progressive, whatever. We can begin to swing in one direction. It goes sometimes, we think, perilously close to over the edge. But then it'll begin swinging back. So the first thing I said to myself, well, there's the ebb and flow. President Obama had a surprise and decisive victory in 2008. By 2012, the Republicans came back and took control of the Congress. That this ebb and flow of politics, that was my first reaction. Second reaction, no getting around it, was a big night for the Democrats. And one that they needed very badly for their own momentum going forward. And it was a repudiation of President Trump. Not a complete repudiation. He still has a very strong base. So that my second thought was, well, this is a repudiation of, I think is a repudiation, this is my own opinion, clearly labeled. This is a repudiation of the tone of President Trump's leadership, not so much a judgment on his policies. I do think there was a strong strain on health care, that health care was a motivating factor for a lot of people. But I think primarily it's what President Trump says, how he says it, what he says, the whole tone of his leadership, that Americans want to believe their president is noble. They want to believe the president has at least a strong strain of attempting for nobility. And even the hardest core Trump supporters with the possibility of known anti-Semites and other bigots would have to be saying to themselves, you know, and some of them do say it publicly, I agree with his, quote, I agree with his policies, but what he says, all these Twitter accounts, so the tone is not wrong. So another reaction to these election results was that this terrible tone of the presidency is taking its toll. But I also had the following, what I saw on television was a lot of celebrating by Democrats. And this may be unpopular with those who are staunch Democrats, but there was a little bit too much moonwalking in the end zone, too much celebrating early. There is, in my opinion, a long way to go for the Democratic Party if it is to recapture leadership, even of the Congress in 2018. So that was another thought I had. I said, well, you know, I think maybe celebrating just a little bit too much. It's understandable. It's election night. They had a much bigger victory than even the Democrats suggested. But, you know, one of the things that I've learned in covering politics, I've been covering politics now, if you can believe it, for more than 70 years. That's 70 years. I know. This lady is covering her face with her hands, and I understand why, ma'am. But one of the things you learn in covering politics is that in politics, overnight is a long time. A week is forever. And the 2018 elections are still, a year away. So it's just a cautionary note that while it was a big night for Democrats, a repudiation of President Trump's, at least of his tone, that the Democrats have a lot of work to do if they're to recapture either one of the legislative branches, never mind both. And I find in talking around the country and hoping to sell a book, promote the book, What Unites Us, that some people take offense at this. But again, this is my opinion clearly labeled as apart from analysis of fact. That if the election were held today, if you use that also, I'm not at all sure that Donald Trump would lose. And for those who are saying, well, it's a gut cinch that he's going to lose in 2020, I would say I would check my whole cards on that, because his base, his fundamental base, has held above 35%. It varies roughly 37, 38, depending on what poll he won. He won the election with, about 42, 43% of the total vote. So it's just, again, as a reporter, I say to myself, well, big night for the Democrats. Yeah, but they got a long way to go. We're not going to get into prognostications here, but one of the reasons I say that if the election were held today, Donald Trump might win the election. His fundamental base holds fairly steady. I don't see any Democrat who yet has come forward and demonstrated that they have or can get a solid base of that size. The Democratic Party has its own splits and fissures. It would be a mistake for the party, in my judgment, if they took this election victory saying, well, you see, the Republicans are split, they're divided. And we, Democrats, are together. Not true. There's the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. There's the Joe Biden wing of the party. I mean, the Democrats have their problems. And that we'll have to see. And when I say I think Trump could win today, it's not saying he would win. I think he could win. There's that old saying that you can't beat somebody with nobody. And the question is, who is the Democrats' somebody? Well, there are several somebodies.
On another note, since we are at the Free Library, I think it's worth mentioning that you devote an entire chapter of your book to the importance of books and literacy. Talk a little bit more about that and why you felt that was important to include.
Well, woven into What Unites Us, the book, are my own personal experiences. I mean, I like to explain why I believe that certain core values are part of what have held us together and can hold us together going forward. And for myself, that I am, and I'm not here to play humble beginnings, but I am the son of two people, neither of whom finished high school, which always seems a little strange to some people. But the place was Texas in the Depression, and this was not unusual. It was not unusual in the country, for that matter. But they were great readers. Our home was not filled with books, but it was filled with newspapers. My parents read newspapers, they discussed newspapers. I think it's one reason I wound up being a reporter, but that's another story for another day. But about the books, that luckily I was introduced to the local library, our neighborhood library, at a very young age. We're talking about 6 or 7. That what I didn't recognize at the time, a social worker in the park who came there to read aloud to children, I was one of them, saw that I was interested and took me to the local branch library. This was a transforming experience for me because it's a small library, but it was a beautiful place. I describe it in What Unites Us. It was by far the most beautiful building I'd ever seen. At any rate, I was introduced to the library early, and it made a tremendous difference in my life, and particularly when I was then, having expressed some interest in the library and being there a lot, was taken to the downtown Houston Library. It was Houston's version of the place we're in tonight. Not nearly as grand and beautiful, but there was a magic land. And so given those experiences, and saying to myself, these experiences in the library literally changed my life. And I know that, the stories of Abraham Lincoln reading to himself, and our better presidents have all been readers. Our better presidents, some but more than others. And by the way, footnote right on the page, I would say, and I say this, if anything, sympathetically, that I think one of President Trump's problems, he has his strengths, is he's not a reader. And why that is, I don't know. But back to my own case, that libraries were so important to me personally, and growing up around books, that in the internet age, it's increasingly difficult to make this argument that books are vital to the strength and health of the nation. But I've done my best in what unites us to make that case.
Well, I'd love, before we go to our audience questions, I'd love for them to hear a little portion of this book in your own voice. We've marked off a little passage from the book, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with us.
Well, I'll do my best. Thank you. This is from near the top of page 3. We hear often of America's destiny. All around Washington, we see marble temples and monuments to our democracy. They look so solid and seem so rooted in history that we imagine them permanent features on the landscape. Never mind that those buildings, when compared to the lifespan of other nations, are but new construction. They were built to infuse a sense of awe and purpose in the populace of an improbable country. They are only as permanent as our ideals, and if we lose a sense of humility, we risk losing everything. The true foundations for those buildings are not brick and stone, but our Constitution, our rule of law, our traditions, our work ethic, our empathy, our pragmatism, and our basic decency. As I have seen over the years, when we cultivate these instincts, we soar. When we sow seeds of division, hatred, and small-mindedness, we falter. As a wave of anxiety sweeps our nation, as big challenges loom before us, I feel an urgency. America at its best is a wonderful, diverse, and spirited chorus. When we sing together, our message is amplified and it can shake the heavens. The songbook for our democracy is infused with our history, the joy of our glories, and the pain of our failures. Its music and lyrics can and must be taught to those who will come after us. Thank you. I will say that all of this business of finding out what happened with the Russians and whatever efforts they made, and getting to the bottom of the various allegations and accusations about hacking is obviously immensely complicated and is going to take time. I do find that there are a lot of people with this situation that you just described and others who, one and sometimes both of two things happen. One, people jump to conclusions before you have enough facts on which to base a conclusion. And the second is that some people tend to think it's all going to become clear fairly quickly because, among other things, we have the special counsel working on it. and at least, two, maybe three parts of Congress, that it will take time. This is going to be slow developing. There'll be headlines and cable television be alive with this revelation and another, but it's going to take time to get to the bottom of this.
Thank you for being here tonight. You mentioned you get paid to be objective, and you have gotten paid to be objective. And certainly when I was growing up with you in my living room, I felt the objectivity coming through. And I now read your Facebook posts, and I think you've taken a different tack there, where you're much more blunt and upfront with your opinions. And I wonder if that was a conscious decision at some point on the way, or something that you felt was incumbent upon you in the face of the current times?
Well, I appreciate the question. It was a conscious decision, but not one of those decisions that I suddenly made. And you're quite right that I spent most of my life, not just my professional life, because my professional life, most of my life, in trying my best to be what used to be called an objective reporter, which is to say, mentally, the sign I hung out to readers, listeners, and viewers was, folks, I've trained myself as best I can to be an honest broker of information. What I'm trying to do is to present to you the truth, or as close to the truth as I can possibly get it, with my biases and my opinions, insofar as it's humanly possible to do so, drained out of it. It's what used to be called, and sometimes it's called now, straight reporting. I spent nearly all of my career trying hard to be that kind of reporter. Others will have to judge how well or how poorly I did it, but that was my goal. That's what I was trying to communicate to you, the consumer of news that I gave. Now, two things happened. One, I am literally in a different stage of my life. I'm now 86 years old. And to use the old Chautauqua line, you know, I'm in an age where I don't even buy green bananas. No. But I reached, you know, a point in my life, and I reached this point in my life at about the same time that I realized that something new, unique, and not normal was happening to our political discourse. This happened during the campaign before the actual election, but grew in my mind with the election. I spent 44 years of my career working for a very large corporation, and by the way, happily so, proud that I did it, loved every minute of it, even the times when, from the outside, it may look unpleasant. But I seek so hard to have you understand what happened, that now I am my own boss. I run a small, one would say, tiny company. 10 people work for me. I don't have to answer to anybody, and therefore I don't answer, so I'm independent. So a combination of age and feeling so deeply that the country was getting deeper and deeper into a perilous situation in which the voices of authoritarianism, extreme nationalism of various degrees, and nativism, that bigotry of a number of kinds seemed to be on the rise to me, including, by the way, anti-Semitism, which doesn't get as much attention as it should. All these things came together in which I just found myself saying, listen, I'm on my own. I don't answer up to anybody, except I want to answer to myself. And so aversion, it didn't descend on me as a sudden revelation, and I mean great respect, but I had my own version of paraphrasing Dr. Martin Luther King's, free at last, great God Almighty, free at last. That I felt I was free to say what I really felt. And I felt I might be able to make a small contribution. So that's what took me to the Facebook post. I did not do, when I was at CBS News, on radio or television. I never did it when I was a print reporter, what I'm doing now, which is to present myself to say, this is what I'm trying to do. It's what I'm trying to say to you. When you look at me, it's pretty simple. I'm a reporter who got lucky, very, very lucky. Nothing more than that, nothing less than that. I don't have any wisdom to impart. I'm not smart enough to have wisdom. I may not even have, on a good day, all that much intelligence. What I have is I have experience. I've been a few places and seen a few things over a long period of time. So perhaps I can put some even tiny, minuscule part of what's happening in some context and perspective, including some historical perspective, and feeling totally free in answering to my own conscience and my own journalistic standard of what I think is needed in today's time. This is the period of my career in which I am now.
During the 2016 presidential campaign, there was a lot of criticism of the press for the way that it covered Donald Trump, that it covered him more like a celebrity than a serious presidential candidate, that it gave him $1 billion worth of free time, quite unlike the coverage of other candidates. I wonder what your reactions are to that and what you think about it.
Well, there's a lot to that argument, and the press has a great deal to answer for. And if it needs to be said, this was not Donald Trump's fault. Insofar as it was a fault, it was the fault of the press, the media, and primarily television. But I think it's a reasonable argument, and I think there's considerable to support the argument that in the never-ceasing drive for improved ratings, yes, and demographics, in the end, money, that many of the larger, particularly television institutions, wound up giving him a lot of free time. Again, while I have my criticisms of Donald Trump, I don't think he can be criticized for it. That he realized that he's good television, quote unquote. And he realized that was one of his strengths, and he sought to take advantage of it. But so there were two parts of where he had an advantage with this, setting aside his own skill at using television. That one part was that he wasn't challenged. That's happened more since he's been president, but particularly in the early stages of his campaign for the nomination, not only did he get unprecedented amounts of free television time, they pretty much got a free pass on being pressed in any question and answer situation. And the reason for that was fairly simple. Because any time he appeared on television, the ratings would jump up. He didn't like tough questions, in particular didn't like tough follow-up questions. Therefore, he had the power to, in effect, say, if you ask me tough questions, I'm not coming back, I'm going across the street to your competitor. And so, long-winded answer, I'm afraid to say, I think that's a valid criticism of the press, particularly during the nominating process and even into the presidential campaign itself, that he got no candidate of any party or any persuasion ever got as much free airtime as President Trump. Now, I think in fairness that those who provided that free time would say he was something new in presidential politics, and therefore he was news, and people were interested in it, and this would be their argument, we did a public service by putting him on as much as we did. I would say gently, not wanting to argue with anybody, that even if you buy that argument, then why wasn't he challenged when he would say things that were demonstrably untrue? I'm not talking about things on which different people can argue. Say things demonstrably untrue. Why wasn't there someone to question him and do follow-up questions? I think that would be a more serious criticism.
So you were talking before about our president's attack on the media and things along that nature. Today it was announced that the Department of Justice may block the AT&T Time Warner purchase. And some people have stated that they think it may be another attack on CNN, saying that in order to proceed, AT&T would either need to sell the DirecTV arm of their business or the portion of Time Warner Cable that actually owns CNN. Do you see that as a valid antitrust argument, or do you see it as potentially another attack on the media by the government, by the DOJ on behalf of the president?
Well, as a journalist, it concerns me. But among the many things I'm not is a lawyer, and certainly not an antitrust lawyer. So for once at least, I want to be careful in my answer, because I think one should be in these circumstances. Whether it was intended to be that or not, I certainly don't feel qualified to say. And the older I get, the longer I live, the longer I go, the more I try not to judge people's motives, but to call into question their judgment. And I would think the Justice Department's action at this particular time, and in this way, without a better explanation, raises a question about their judgment. And if that sounds too cautious an answer, I intend it to be a very cautious answer. But this much, whether it applies in this case or not, though, I'm glad you asked the question, because whether it applies in this particular case or not, whether the motive was to send a signal of intimidation or not. One of the ongoing problems that we have, folks, and I find, and I mean this in no patronizing way, that many people don't understand it, that the ever-increasing consolidation of media, ever larger international conglomerates owning more and more of news dissemination platforms, has been for some time an ongoing problem. That, as we sit here tonight, at easily 80%, I think more than 80%, of the true national distribution of news is controlled by no more than 6, and I actually think the count is 4, 6 very large companies. Now think about that for a moment. And without belaboring the point, this is where I think every thinking citizen should give it some thought. These very large corporations that control more than 80% of the true national distribution of news, they all have all kinds of things that they need the powers that be in Washington to provide. Whether that powers be in the control of Democrats or Republicans, they need legislation passed and legislation stopped. They need regulations done away with and new regulations put in, for example, the number of television stations that one company can own, that kind of thing. And of course, the power in Washington, political power in Washington, again, whether it be Republican or Democrat, I'm not getting into false equivalency, but either one, they all want sweetheart coverage. They don't want reporters digging and drilling deep into things that the public shouldn't know. So, and I hope you'll forgive my reporter's language here, what has developed over the last, not just the last 4 or 5 years, the last 12 years, really over the last 30 or 35 years, is that very big business is in bed with big government in Washington, and there's pressure for news to satisfy their needs. news not in the public interest, but in their interest, the interest of the very large businesses, and in the interest of whatever political power happens to be in power at that time. Now, this has happened fairly slowly, and most people haven't even been aware of it. But going forward, now as we continue to have ever more consolidation here in the post-digital divide internet era, this is a question that I think every thinking citizen, whether they're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, reactionary, progressive, needs to think about. And that is the lack of competition when it comes to true national distribution of news, the lack of competition, the ever consolidating in the hands of fewer and fewer and larger companies, and the fact that a sense of public service has pretty much gone out of particularly electronic journalism. That you say, well, what is Dan talking about here? Well, I'll give you a specific example. There was a time, before you had all this consolidation, that the view of the corporate structure over which major network news divisions operated, their view of news was, we'd like to make money with it, but if we don't make money with it, that's all right. We consider news a public service to be operated as something of a public trust in the public's interest. Now, mind you, they were always going to make money. They said, look, we're going to make money. But with news, that's going to be our contribution to public service. Therefore, if an anchor person or a news division president came and said, you know, we need to have a national discussion about Afghanistan, and we'd like to put on a documentary about Afghanistan at 10 p.m. at night. Up until roughly the mid-1980s, that program would play. Today, if you go into any of the mahogany rows, which is to say the corporate suites that control things, and make the argument, you know, we need an hour of prime time at 10 o'clock tonight to discuss racial injustice or Afghanistan, I guarantee you one of two things is going to happen. One, you're going to be considered a candidate for a mental institution, or you're going to be accused of smoking something very, very expensive. No, I do joke about it, I mean to take the point. And that's because we've moved from an era in which there was a sense of news is to be done in the public's interest, as a public service, as a public trust, and those who at the very top of the corporations had and took that as a responsibility has now been wiped away almost in its entirety. There are a few places. And that's something, as I say, that ought to concern everybody, whatever their political persuasion.
Well, we are about out of time, but before we go, Mr. Rather, we tend to save the hardest questions for last here, and I'm wondering, how about those Astros?
Well, you know, I have in mind that I'm in Philadelphia. And that Philadelphia knows about the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat.
How well we know.
And the Astros, having never won a World Series before, and you know, being from Houston, I was particularly glad to see the Astros win. You know, the Dodgers had a great team. I thought the Dodgers would win, but Houston and the Gulf Coast has gone through so much with Hurricane Harvey, and still is going through such a difficult time. It was fortuitous that the Astros won. They have a good young team. But the Phillies, you know, the Phillies built themselves into a strength. They've done it a number of times over the history of baseball, and the Astros finally managed to do it. But I will say, and answer your question, I don't belabor it, I was driving with my wife when, I can't remember the year, Houston was playing the Phillies for the right to go to the World Series. And the game Nolan Ryan was pitching, 8th inning. Phillies had the bases loaded. And my wife said to me, Dan, pull the car over on the side of the road and stop. You were listening so closely to the game that I'm afraid you're going to wreck the car. And in that game, the Phillies won. But thank you for asking.
Dan Rather, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.